Imagine you're packed onto a 70-foot wooden ship with 60 other men. You're crossing the North Atlantic. The journey will take weeks, maybe months. There's no bathroom, no running water, no privacy. And here's the problem that should have killed everyone on board. You all need to use the toilet, multiple times a day, for weeks on end, on a cramped wooden vessel where you're literally sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your crewmates. In the 21st century, modern cruise ships with advanced sanitation systems still struggle with disease outbreaks. Norovirus can tear through a ship with bathrooms, plumbing, and professional medical staff in days. The Vikings had none of that. So how did they survive? How did they cross the Atlantic to reach Iceland, Greenland, and North America without entire crews being wiped out by dysentery, cholera, or any of the dozen other diseases that should have spread like wildfire in those conditions? Today, you're going to learn the answer, and I promise you, it's not what you think. Because the Vikings didn't just survive despite the odds. They engineered a waste management system so effective that it challenges everything we think we know about medieval hygiene. First, let's understand exactly how impossible this situation was. A typical Viking longship was about 70 feet long and maybe 15 feet wide at its widest point. Into this space, you'd pack 50 to 80 men, depending on the voyage, plus supplies, plus cargo, plus weapons and armor. There was no below deck in the way we think of it. Longships were open vessels. Everything happened on the same level, exposed to the elements. When you're making a long voyage, say from Norway to Iceland, you're looking at anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks of continuous sailing, depending on the weather. To Greenland, 2 to 4 weeks. To North America, even longer. During that entire time, every single person on that ship needs to eat, drink, and yes, deal with the inevitable biological consequences. Modern research shows that the average person produces about 128 grams of fecal matter per day. Multiply that by 60 men over 2 weeks, and you're looking at over 240 pounds of human waste that needs to go somewhere. And that's assuming everyone stays healthy. If disease breaks out, if even one person gets dysentery or food poisoning, you're now dealing with people who might need to relieve themselves 10, 15, 20 times a day. In severe cases, people can produce several pounds of liquid waste daily, on a wooden ship, with no bathroom, in the middle of the ocean. This should have been a death sentence. Historical accounts from other maritime cultures confirm this. When the Spanish crossed the Atlantic in the 1500s, with much larger ships and more space, disease killed more sailors than storms, combat, and accidents combined. A 1700s medical log from a Danish ship to the West Indies recorded that out of a crew of 322, the majority suffered from dysentery, diarrhea, vomiting, and various infectious diseases during the voyage. And that was with access to primitive toilets, some medical knowledge, and ships several times larger than Viking longships. So what did the Vikings know that everyone else didn't? Here's the first critical element. The Vikings understood wind direction and fluid dynamics better than most people realize. On a Viking longship, when nature called, you went to the bow, the front of the ship. This area became known as the head, which is why we still call ship bathrooms the head today. But this wasn't random. It was calculated engineering. Viking longships used square sails. When you're sailing with a square sail, the wind is always, and I mean always, coming from behind the ship, pushing you forward. This means the wind is constantly blowing from the stern toward the bow. If you positioned yourself at the very front of the ship, any smell, any spray, any biological unpleasantness would be carried away from the crew by the wind. You'd literally hang over the side of the ship, secured by ropes or bracing yourself against the carved figurehead, and do your business directly into the ocean. The current would immediately carry waste away from the ship. The wind would carry any odor away from your crewmates. And the constant spray of seawater provided a natural cleaning mechanism. But here's where it gets interesting. Vikings didn't just randomly hang off the side. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest they used a communal rope. One long rope would be secured to the bow, hanging down into the water. After someone relieved themselves, they'd clean themselves with this seawater-soaked rope. The rope would dangle in the ocean, constantly being washed by seawater and the ship's movement through the waves. It sounds primitive. It sounds unsanitary by modern standards. But think about what's happening. That rope is being continuously sanitized by salt water, one of nature's most effective antibacterial agents. The same salt water that's been used for thousands of years to preserve food and clean wounds. But location was only half the solution. The Vikings also understood something crucial about disease prevention: timing. Here's what most people don't realize. Viking voyages weren't continuous multi-week ordeals in the way we imagine them. Vikings were coastal navigators. Even on their longest journeys, they would stop, frequently. When sailing from Norway to Iceland, they'd stop at the Shetland Islands, then the Faroe Islands. These weren't just rest stops. They were strategic sanitation breaks. Every few days, the crew would go ashore. And here's what they'd do. They'd dig latrines, simple pit toilets away from their temporary camps. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlement sites across the North Atlantic confirms this. These shore stops served multiple purposes. They'd restock fresh water, hunt or gather food, make repairs, and critically, they'd give everyone a chance to properly relieve themselves on solid ground, away from the ship. This regular pattern of stops prevented the buildup of waste on the ship itself. It gave people's digestive systems a break from the constant motion of the sea. Because seasickness and its attendant digestive issues are far worse when you're continuously at sea. But there's another element here that's even more brilliant. Vikings timed their voyages seasonally. They didn't sail during winter. They didn't sail during the stormiest months. They waited for late spring and summer, when weather was more predictable and seas were calmer. Why does this matter for disease prevention? Because calmer seas mean less seasickness. Less seasickness means less digestive distress. Less digestive distress means fewer opportunities for disease to spread through contaminated waste. It's all connected. Now, let's talk about something that sounds completely unrelated but was absolutely critical: what Vikings ate at sea. Viking ship provisions were specifically chosen not just for preservation, but for their effects on digestion. Dried fish, hardtack, dried meats, fermented foods. These weren't random choices. These foods produced firm, predictable waste. Unlike fresh fruits, vegetables, and certain grains that can cause loose stools or digestive upset, the Viking sea diet created consistency. And consistency is crucial when you're managing waste without plumbing. Modern research on Norwegian prison diets, which are ironically similar in some ways to Viking sea rations, shows that these types of preserved, low-moisture foods significantly reduce the frequency of bowel movements. Some people on these diets only need to defecate once every 2 to 3 days instead of multiple times daily. Multiply that across 60 men over 2 weeks, and you've just reduced your total waste output by half or more. But there's another factor: fermented foods. Vikings consumed large amounts of fermented fish, skyr, a fermented dairy product, and other probiotic-rich foods. Modern science has confirmed that these foods promote healthy gut bacteria, which improves digestive efficiency and reduces the likelihood of infections. The Vikings didn't know about gut bacteria. They didn't have microscopes or medical journals. But they knew, through centuries of trial and error, that people who ate these foods got sick less often at sea. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. You might think Vikings were generally filthy people who didn't care about cleanliness. Popular media certainly portrays them that way. But archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Vikings bathed regularly. We know this because the Old Norse word for Saturday, laugardagrem, literally means bathing day. Combs, tweezers, and grooming tools are among the most common artifacts found in Viking graves. These aren't luxury items buried with nobility. These are everyday objects found in common graves. Anglo-Saxon chronicles actually complained that Vikings were too clean. There are recorded complaints that Scandinavian men were seducing English women because they bathed weekly and kept their hair groomed, which was apparently more than local men were doing. This matters for our story because Vikings understood, at some fundamental level, that cleanliness prevented disease. They didn't know about germ theory. They didn't understand the mechanism. But they knew that people who washed regularly stayed healthier. They knew that grooming prevented parasites like lice. They knew that clean crews survived voyages better than filthy ones. So even on longships, even with limited fresh water, Vikings maintained basic hygiene standards. They'd use seawater to wash their hands and faces. They'd groom their hair and beards. They'd change into cleaner clothing when they went ashore. These small practices added up to significant disease prevention. Now, before you think Vikings had discovered some perfect system, let me be completely honest with you. They didn't. People still got sick. People still died. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age human remains shows evidence of intestinal parasites, tapeworms, roundworms, and other nasties. We know Vikings suffered from these. A 10th century Islamic geographer named Ibn Fadlan traveled with Vikings on their trading ships and described them as having poor hygiene and being riddled with parasites. So what's the truth? The truth is that Vikings didn't prevent all disease. They couldn't. Nobody in the medieval world could. But what they did do, and this is crucial, was reduce disease to manageable levels. They didn't eliminate the problem. They managed it well enough that most crews survived most voyages. And in the brutal calculus of medieval seafaring, most crews surviving most voyages was actually a stunning success. Compare Viking mortality rates to later European exploration. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he lost 0 ships, but significant portions of his crew to disease. When Magellan circumnavigated the globe starting in 1519, he lost 80% of his crew, most to disease, not combat or shipwreck. Vikings were making similar voyages 500 years earlier, in smaller ships, with less medical knowledge, and their survival rates were comparable or better. That's not luck, that's system. If you're finding this breakdown of Viking engineering and survival fascinating, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. We're digging into the real history, the practical, sometimes gross, always brilliant solutions that people created to survive in impossible conditions. Hit that subscribe button because next week we're covering something even more disturbing about medieval warfare that'll change how you think about castle sieges forever. So here's what we know. Vikings survived long ocean voyages with primitive sanitation through a combination of smart positioning, strategic timing, careful diet, and basic hygiene practices. But here's what keeps me up at night. We only know about the successful voyages. Think about that for a second. Every Viking longship that made it to Iceland, to Greenland, to North America. Those are the ships we know about. Those are the expeditions that get recorded in sagas and leave archaeological evidence. But what about the ships that didn't make it? Medieval mortality rates for any kind of travel were horrific by modern standards. Historians estimate that anywhere from 10 to 30% of people undertaking long journeys in this period died en route. For Vikings specifically, we have evidence of ships that simply vanished. Expeditions that left and never returned. Names in sagas of ships that sailed west and were never seen again. How many of those disappeared because disease broke out aboard? How many crews, despite their clever waste management systems and their careful preparations, succumbed to dysentery or cholera or typhoid in the middle of the North Atlantic? There's no way to know. Those ships sank. Those men died. Their bodies were never recovered. Their stories were never told. What we're looking at, these successful Viking voyages we marvel at, these represent the survivors, the ships where the system worked. But somewhere, scattered across the ocean floor between Norway and North America, are the wrecks of ships where the system failed. Ships where one sick crew member infected everyone else. Where dysentery spread through the entire crew faster than they could manage it. Where men became too weak from illness to sail, and the ship drifted until it sank or smashed against rocks. The Vikings we celebrate, the ones who made it to new lands, who established settlements, who returned home with tales of adventure. They were the lucky ones. They were the ones where everything went right. Where the wind blew favorably, where the diet worked, where nobody brought a contagious disease aboard, where the sea stayed calm enough to make regular shore stops. And here's the truly disturbing part. We've built our entire understanding of Viking capabilities based on their successes. We look at the settlements in Iceland and say, Vikings must have been incredible sailors. They crossed 600 miles of open ocean. We see the remains in Greenland and think, they must have had superior navigation and survival skills. But we're only seeing the survivors. For every ship that made it, how many didn't? For every crew that successfully implemented their waste management system and stayed healthy enough to complete the voyage, how many failed? We'll never know. Because failure in the North Atlantic left no archaeological evidence. Just empty seas and families in Norway who waited for ships that never returned. The Viking waste management system we've discussed today, the head positioning, the timing strategy, the diet, the hygiene practices, all of that was brilliant. All of that worked. But it didn't work every time. It just worked often enough that some ships made it through. Often enough that the Viking age of exploration could happen. Often enough that we remember their successes and forget their failures. And maybe that's the most important lesson here. The Vikings didn't conquer the impossible problem of long-distance sea travel with primitive sanitation. They just survived it at rates high enough to keep trying. They lost ships. They lost men. They lost entire expeditions to disease, storms, and disasters we can only imagine. But enough succeeded that we remember them as master seafarers. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other historical successes are we celebrating while ignoring the invisible bodies of those who tried the same thing and failed? How many Viking ships are still out there, somewhere in the dark water, carrying the skeletons of men who did everything right and died anyway? Think about that the next time you hear about Viking exploration. And ask yourself, what aren't we seeing?